Nigeria's rising debt has continued to elicit heated public debate as the public and private sector experts express concerns over the country's fiscal sustainability amidst dwindling national revenue. According to latest data from the Debt Management Office, the country's debt has risen by about 4 trillion naira in the past 5 months to accumulate to 45.25 trillion naira. The debt stock, which stood at 32.92 trillion naira by December 2020, rose to 39.5 trillion naira by December 2021 and rose further to 41.6 trillion naira by the end of the first quarter. A breakdown of total debt stock hinged the increase of external debt in currency depreciation from 16.6 trillion naira in the first quarter to 16.9 trillion naira as at the end of last month, while domestic debt rose to 24.98 trillion naira in the first quarter to 28.32 trillion naira as at the end of August as a result of new issuances, where federal governments accounted for more than 88% of debt stock. To give more insights into this development and, of course, other burning economic issues, I'm being joined live from our Abuja studios by Professor Uche Uwaleke. He is the professor of capital markets at Nasarawa State University and also the president of the Association of Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria. Prof, thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much, Tolu. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Now, Prof, let's go straight to the debt stock figures that we have, 45.25 trillion naira, an increase of about 4 trillion in just a few months. What is your assessment? Many times you argue that it's what the funds is used for that remains very important. But at the moment, this borrowing seems to be scary.
Absolutely.
And we must continue to borrow as the deficit is on the high side.
Yes. Absolutely, Tolu. Let me reiterate it. What is important is what the debt is being applied to. We shouldn't really make it look as if debt is bad. Debt in itself is not bad, and it is for that reason that debt is seen as leverage. In finance balance, another term for it is leverage, gearing. I know what that means. A lever is something that helps you to move up. So debt in itself is not bad. Fundamentally, that's the fact. It's what's important is the application of the proceeds, from such borrowing. As you rightly mentioned, the concerns are mounting, partly because of the rate of the uptick in borrowing. Between 2014 and 2021, for example, the total debt stock rose by close to 250%. And the external component even increased by over 850%. So the rate of the uptick, again, is something that gives concern to a number of people. But I still have to reiterate the point or emphasize the point that it's not about borrowing, but what we do with the money we are borrowing. And that also leads me to the other concern. The other concern, which is that it does appear that part of that borrowing, hasn't gone into infrastructure. Part of that borrowing has gone into recurrent spending, largely consumption, which of course gives cause for worry. If you look at the, I think it was even contained in the 2023 to 25 medium-term expenditure framework, the one that was unveiled recently, where we saw that between January and April 2022, government revenue, total revenue was in the region of 1.6 trillion, whereas debt service was 1.94 trillion. So a situation in which debt service is in excess of total revenue, leaves a lot of cause for worry. What that means is that you are effectively borrowing to even service debt. So when you get to a point where you borrow to service debt, of course, you cannot pretend that there isn't, a debt, a debt situation or a debt issue. It has often been argued that the problem is not the size of the debt, but more of the revenue. So you hear the argument that it's not the debt issue, is a revenue issue. Yes, to a large extent, it's a revenue issue. But when that revenue is not increasing in proportion to the growth in the debt stock, then what that means is that we should rethink the strategy of borrowing, largely to fund fiscal deficits. Fiscal deficits at the percentage of GDP, has been growing, and what is disturbing is, as I mentioned earlier, much of that debt hasn't gone into capital expenditure. If you look at the composition of the domestic debt stock, you will agree with me that we need to tinker with the strategy that we're using at the moment. The strategy that emphasizes FGM bonds at the expense of real infrastructure bonds. FGM bond makes up over 70% of total domestic debt stock. So if you look at domestic debt by instruments, FGM bond accounts for over 70%. Okay, whereas the real infrastructure bonds there, which in my view are, you have the Sukuk and the green bond. The two of them, account for less than 4% of the total domestic debt stock. So you see what the point I was making. When you issue bonds that are not tied to infrastructure, okay, you run the temptation, you run the risk of diverting those funds to some other uses, even when you originally planned to use them for infrastructure. Okay, you may end up channeling them to recurrent spending, channeling them to consumption, and then that puts you further into a debt problem, as it were. So that's why I said we need to change our strategy with respect to the instruments we are even using for domestic debt. Okay, which is why I would advise that a lot more attention should be paid to infrastructure bonds. We should give more attention to Sukuk bonds. In other climes, you hear governments issuing railway bonds, for example. When you issue a railway bond, it means the proceeds will go to railway. But when you issue bonds without ring fencing the proceeds, that's not too good for a developing country like Nigeria. Now, the other aspect too has to do with the external component. If you look at the external component, in recent times, again, as I mentioned earlier, external debt has grown by nearly 900% between 2014 and now. And my worry about that, I'm not against the fact that we are borrowing from outside, okay? Because if you look at the debt management strategy itself, it's a strategy that tends to rebalance the debt mix more in favor of external. Of course, before now we've had so much of domestic debt. So right now the mix is more like in the region of 60-40. 40% external, 60% domestic, which is more in line with what the strategy is saying. But my problem with the mix of our external debt today, Tolu, is that, again, it's being dominated by commercial debts. If you look at the multilateral part, multilateral accounts about 47.7%. Bilateral debts, which are debts we have taken from China Exim Bank, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, the French Development Agency, the Indian Exim Bank, and Germany. If you look at those, they account for around 11%. But the commercial ones, which in large part are Eurobonds, okay, it is now accounting for nearly 40%. 39.8% of total external debt stock. Okay, you have 13 outstanding euro bonds, at the moment. And if you look at their yield, relative to the yield at issue, you will now see that their yields have risen relative to the yields at issue, of course, meaning that their prices, are going down. So over time, it's becoming more expensive for the government to service commercial debts. And that is why I also think, with respect to commercial external debts, we should tread with caution when we go to the international debt markets, when we go to international capital markets, taking euro bonds. Okay, we should lean more towards multilateral, towards concessional loans from multilateral sources, which, of course, in my view, are usually developmental in nature, because they are very long term in nature, and they also come at concessional rates. And if you look at our Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007, Prof. That is also what encourages.
All right, Prof, so can you hear me?
It's important that we balance these two when we are taking loans.
Yes. Prof, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, right. I can hear you, Tolu.
Great, Prof. I like that form of deep introduction, letting us understand some of the fundamentals or how we got to this point. But I'd like to ask, how much of a fear do you have with regards to what this means for fiscal sustainability in Nigeria? That's my worry, and I'm sure many others.
Of course, it poses a major threat to fiscal sustainability. Part of why the fiscal deficit, has continued to rise. A situation in which debt service, crowds out development, spending is, of course, not in the interest of the economy at all. You can imagine a situation in which we spend, even going by the budget provision, over 3 trillion naira in debt service. That's budget provision. But usually we know that the actual debt service payments will normally be in excess of what you're provided in the budget. So if you are spending over 3 trillion to service debt alone, and in many instances, what you're spending is even higher than what you're provided for capital expenditure, then of course we need to rethink that kind of fiscal arrangement, because it's not in the interest of development. And again, look at it this way: you have external debt that is about $40 billion, and then your external reserves are about $38.9 billion. You have external debt that is higher than your external reserves. Again, that's something to worry about, because what it means is that even if you are to devote your entire external reserve to settle your external debt,
you can't even meet up.
You will still have something left to be paid. So we wouldn't have anything at all by way of external reserves if we were to use all of that to settle our external debt. So you can see why I said that however you look at it, it's not a welcome development. Is something that should worry everybody, especially those that are in charge of managing our economy.
Now, there's also an argument, or many analysts have argued, that if there is a proper scrutiny of our national budget, we can reduce the level of deficit. If the deficit is lower, then of course the borrowing will be lower. What do you think about that submission?
Absolutely. That absolutely. When you have fiscal deficits, you are bound to finance the fiscal deficit, via borrowing. If you look at our recent history, where we usually provide for borrowing as a means of financing fiscal deficit, Sometimes we also say, okay, we hope to sell some assets, or we hope to privatize, some of us. So you have privatization proceeds, and then borrowing. But most of the time, of course, you find that very little comes by way of privatization proceeds. So you end up financing your deficit, and largely, via borrowing. So the more you attempt to have a fiscal balance, to close the gap between your budget, your revenue, anticipated revenue, and anticipated expenditure or projected expenditure, the more you close that and you tend towards a budget balance. Of course, that means your borrowing needs, will reduce. But again, I must say this, that as a developing economy, okay, a budget balance or even a budget surplus may not appear ideal for a developing economy. Most developing economies, let me not say every, have budget deficit. So it is normal to have a budget deficit, especially when that deficit is arising because you need to finance more of capital expenditure. Okay, of course you need to grow. In Nigeria, for example, it is said that the stock of infrastructure to GDP is very low, as low as 35%, compared to, say, South Africa, where you have stock of infrastructure to GDP in excess of 80%. So with very low infrastructure stock, relative to peer countries, we can't afford not to do something about infrastructure. And one of the ways by which you can, of course, drive infrastructure growth is through long-term borrowing. But again, when it is done in the right way, when you use the right instruments, to do that. So yes, reducing deficit will reduce borrowing. But as I said earlier on, that doesn't mean that that's an ideal situation. We can have deficit, yes, we can borrow, but if we borrow right, and particularly when we involve the private sector in financing infrastructure, I think that is what this country needs at the moment.
Prof, you're the expert here, so I'd like you to educate us. Is there any justification for a country like Nigeria, like we've been borrowing, considering the fact that the effects of COVID-19, the effects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, all shock that also happened in 2015, some say the country has no choice but than to borrow. Do you think that in any form, that will be justified in any form? Well, we had no choice, just had to keep borrowing. Are we not looking inwards? I want us to talk inwards. We need to look inwards now. How well are we doing that?
Yes, I think you've made the points. Again, to be fair, part of why the borrowing has risen has also to do with the external shocks the country has been exposed to in recent times. In 2016, we saw the price of oil, crash. The economy went into a recession. For 5 consecutive quarters, we're in a recession. And of course, the economy needed to be stimulated to get out of recession. So that resulted in some borrowing. Again, in 2020, COVID came. The economy was in a recession. Government, put in place a sustainability plan that also involved them, some borrowing, to get the economy, out very quickly, out of recession. But again, it must be mentioned that even the figure you talked about, reported by the DMO, doesn't tell the full story, it's not the full picture of the country's total debt stock. Because if you talk about total debt, total public debt should represent the total government's obligation, to outsiders. When I mean outsiders, I mean those outside the government, whether internal or external. So that will now include what the government is owing the Central Bank of Nigeria, because the government has borrowed so much from the Central Bank of Nigeria. We're here, in trillions of naira. That will also include the debt owed to contractors, contractor arrears, that should also include judgment debts.
Professor Waleke are still online to wrap up his submission with regards to, well, you talked about the external reserves not even being able to sort out our debt. What is the outlook, wrapping up this discussion now in 2 minutes?
Sure, you put out there the burial ceremony of the Queen. Well, may her soul rest in peace. And I hope that the new era will usher in a more a prosperous or mutually beneficial, relationship, between Nigeria and UK. As you know, the UK is a major source of capital importation to Nigeria, and of course that also helps our reserves. And I also want to see a situation in which, going forward, the UK will support Nigeria's effort at trying to get debt relief. We had a debt relief in 2005, you recall, but that was when we were exposed so much to the Paris Club. But now we still have some debts we are owing the multilateral institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, for example. I want to see a situation in which the new administration in the UK, including, of course, with the support of the monarchy, will really help Nigeria to sort out its debt issue.
All right there. Well, it's a good way to leave it. I've been speaking to Professor Uche Uwaleke there, Professor of Capital Markets at the Nasarawa State University, KEFI. He's also the president of the Association of Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria. Thank you, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Thank you.